Let's talk blood vessels. In this video, I'm going to go over the path of blood through the body, which you might already know from a previous video, and then we're going to talk about the structure of blood vessels. Let's take a look at that path of blood. If we start at the heart, we know that blood will move from the heart into arteries. It's the job of arteries to take blood away from the heart. Blood that's in the arteries will eventually flow into really small arteries called arterioles, and then the arterioles lead into capillaries. Capillaries are the actual site of exchange between the blood and the tissues of the body. So we're not exchanging gases or water or other nutrients between arteries and the tissues of the body. We do that exchange specifically at capillaries. Once the exchange is complete, the blood will flow from the capillaries into venules, which are really tiny veins. The blood from the venules will flow into the veins, and then the veins will bring the blood back to the heart. Now let's take a closer look at the structure of a blood vessel wall. Blood vessels are tubes, hollow tubes. The space inside of it's called the lumen, and that's where we find blood. But the tube itself has a wall, and this wall is made of 3 layers, or tunics, if you will. The Tunica Interna, the Tunica Media, and the Tunica Externa, also known as adventitia. So the Tunica Interna is the innermost layer of the wall. This is the only part of the wall that actually will be making contact with the blood. Just deep to that, we will find the Tunica Media, where we're going to have smooth muscle. And then the outside of the tube is where we find the Tunica Externa, and as I said, that's also known as the adventitia. Let's look at each of these tunics in more detail. Let's start with the Tunica Interna. So this is the layer that will be in contact with the actual blood that's flowing through the blood vessel. The tissue that we're going to find here that makes up the Tunica Interna is simple squamous epithelial tissue. So simple meaning 1 cell layer thick, squamous meaning flattened in shape. And this layer also has another name. It's also known as the endothelium. This layer is continuous with the endocardium of the heart. And it's really smooth and slippery. And this is important because platelets like to stick to anything that's rough or sticky outy. And we need this layer to be nice and smooth so that the platelets don't accidentally start sticking to it. There is a little bit of connective tissue that is just behind the simple squamous epithelial tissue, and this just kind of helps to glue the Tunica Interna to the next layer, the Tunica Media. In terms of the function of the Tunica Interna, as I mentioned already, it helps to prevent unwanted clotting, right? So it's protective in nature. When we look specifically at arteries, we see that the Tunica Interna of the arteries can release chemicals that will help to regulate the constriction and dilation of the arteries, and this can regulate blood flow through the arteries, and ultimately this means that it can change how much blood is being delivered to the tissues being fed by that particular artery. We'll look at this in more detail later. When we look at capillaries, we see that a capillary is pretty much only made of Tunica Interna. So in other words, the capillaries aren't going to have the Tunica Media and the Tunica Externa. They're just made of Tunica Interna. And at the capillary level, the function of the Tunica Interna here is to obviously help for exchange of material. By being only 1 cell layer thick, it's going to make it really easy to get materials across that layer. Just behind the Tunica Interna is the Tunica Media. The Tunica Media is not present in capillaries, and it's the thickest in arteries. Veins do have a Tunica Media, but it's just much less developed than what we see in arteries. In terms of its structure, the Tunica Media is mostly made of muscle. Media starts with M, muscle starts with M. Of course, this is smooth muscle. The body has 3 types of muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue, which is found exclusively in the heart. skeletal muscle tissue, which is the tissue we find for the most part attached to our bones and is responsible for large body movements. And then we have smooth muscle, which is commonly found in the walls of hollow organs, like blood vessels. In addition to the smooth muscle, there is a layer of really stretchy elastic protein fibers in the tunica media. And this is really important, especially for arteries, because the arteries need to be able to stretch as the blood enters into them. The tunica media does have nervous system input coming to it. So the nervous system input coming into the tunica media is coming from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So recall that the autonomic nervous system is there to help regulate subconscious body activities, or a lot of students like to say automatic body activities, things you don't consciously control. And the sympathetic division is usually activated with our fight or flight response. So it's activated under emergencies or stress or roller coasters. We'll talk more about the importance of this sympathetic innervation in another video. Because capillaries don't have tunica media, and because the veins tunica media is not highly developed, we're going to concentrate on the function of the tunica media at arteries. So remember, this is muscle tissue, so it can contract and relax. The fancy name for contraction of this tissue here is called vasoconstriction, and the relaxation is called vasodilation. When vasoconstriction occurs and the smooth muscle contracts, the lumen of the artery gets smaller. When vasodilation occurs, the lumen of the artery gets bigger. And so we can use this to regulate blood flow to the organs that are being fed by these arteries, and we can also use it to regulate blood pressure. We talk a lot more about vasoconstriction and vasodilation in a different video about blood pressure. But just keep in mind that this particular layer is how we're going to regulate blood pressure and flow of blood to tissues. The outermost layer to a blood vessel is called the tunica externa or tunica adventitia. In terms of its structure, it's mostly made of connective tissue, which kind of makes sense because the function is to basically just connect the blood vessel to the surrounding tissue so that it doesn't move around very much. As mentioned previously, capillaries are made exclusively of tunica interna, so they lack this tunica externa. Here we see a histological slide of two arteries and a vein. The veins often look like they collapse in a histological slide because indeed they do. The lack of the muscle tissue in the vein makes them a little bit flappier, and so when you try to slice a tissue that has a vein in it and then put it on a microscope slide, there's nothing really to hold the wall of that vein open anymore because there's no blood inside the vein and there's no nice muscle tissue to keep it open. So this is the vein and these two are arteries. I believe this is actually a histological slide taken from the umbilical cord because the umbilical cord contains two arteries and a vein. If we look at the artery, this layer here facing the lumen will be our tunica interna. This layer here is the tunica media with all that nice smooth muscle. And then this will be our tunica externa.